He's asking Melyssa for Joe's kind of asking Melyssa. I saw the clip. Melyssa was kind of like footing around. She didn't really want to answer. You know, that was kind of like her bop a little bit. I guess she would be uncomfortable or whatever. Who knows? The only way they ask me a question and I squirm a little bit is if they bring in the police. You heard me? Ain't no man making me squirm. They human like me.
Yeah, so on her podcast, which by the way pulls some really solid numbers for an indie show, she jumped into the ongoing back and forth between Jason Lee, Joe Budden, and Melyssa Ford. And she said something that caught my attention. She pointed out a moment when Melyssa Ford appeared on the Joe Budden podcast, and Budden started digging into Jason Lee's case in Stockton, talking about how funds were allegedly mismanaged. Then, when the question shifted to Melyssa, asking her opinion, she straight up refused to answer. Here's the clip.
About this over there in Hollywood. How do you feel about this? Man? Mel always look like the lights just got cut on. How do you ask that question? Mel, are you awake, girl?
I am. I don't even know how to respond.
He's not going to get at you if you comment. That's what you're concerned? We will fry him up.
I'm not concerned about that. I
don't know.
I'm just...
As you can see there, Melyssa Ford was definitely afraid of talking about Jason Lee. And the theory behind that is essentially, hey man, Jason Lee knows everything about Melyssa Ford. He had a podcast with her. Jason Lee was her shoulder to cry on for a long period of time. He knows where her bodies are buried. And that would be a solid theory because she did look really afraid, like the trunk was going to get opened up and all her secrets would be revealed. Mona would say, yo, she was scared. And then later on, she would say, I wouldn't hold my tongue for nobody. For her to say that was interesting, largely because I feel like the first time she was on the podcast and Melyssa Ford wasn't there, she was like, oh, I wanted Melyssa Ford to be here because, I really like her. And then she even took that picture for tonight's conversation where it made it seem like they were pretty cool. And now we get to this episode of her podcast and she comments on Melyssa Ford, kind of depicting her as scary. And I also feel like it was contradictory because there's been a couple of people who've called out Mona and she hasn't really said anything publicly. She said it on her Instagram live. She didn't necessarily say it on the podcast. I'm talking particularly about people like academics, Tony the Closer. Those types of folks were really calling her out, screaming her name in the streets, and she largely ignored it. But what was interesting about this is that this reflected the differences in the two, whereas Mona swears she would have spoken about the situation, and Melyssa Ford says she would never have spoken. Well, she didn't say it. You can clearly see that she will never speak about Jason Lee. I thought it was shade. I thought she would have been more cognizant of the fact that her speaking on Melyssa Ford, especially on her podcasts, could look a certain way, but she didn't seem to particularly care. And I gotta say one more thing. Maybe the fact that Melyssa Ford wouldn't have spoken is a sign of how good she was as a podcaster. I know that sounds crazy, but I'm just saying it's in sharp contrast to Mona, who feels the need to talk and fill up dead air. Mona really reminds me of those people who I've met in my life that just talk because they can't stand silence. She has an imaginary personality. She knows how to envision things, but it comes at the cost of those people around her. She lacks the measured tone that Melyssa Ford used to capture. But it's easy to remember that when Melyssa Ford was on the podcast, she would be quiet for long periods of time, and she would not provide input on many of the subjects. As for Melyssa Ford, I think her podcast was nominated for an NAACP award. That's right, Hot and Bothered, the podcast that was ridiculed by me and many others, is now possibly going to win a big-time award. And it's quite a revelation, largely because I think they joked about Melyssa Ford winning the NAACP on the Joe Budden podcast. And if she actually wins it, oh my God, you're going to see everybody start to say, look what she did without Joe. She got away from Joe and she finally got an award. And that is why you start a podcast in those niches. I mean, it's real. It's not that crowded a niche. If you have a personality, if you have a celebrity, you'll largely stand out. And I think that's why she's getting the award. It seems like, hey, but even if you look at Mandy, she would start a podcast in niches like therapy, in niches like, sexual health, because it's easy to stand out in those fields versus pop culture. There are a lot of pop culture podcasts. If you start a podcast in that field, you're really not going to capture much of an audience unless you have a celebrity and so on. All right, y'all, that's my video for now. A quick one. Let me know what you think about this Melyssa Ford commentary that Mona had on her podcast. I know we've been hating on Mona, and I'm going to be doing a video about Mona, a very long video on Sunday, where I analyze her last rough couple of episodes and really break down every bit and all that. But, she's just been kind of killing it on her podcast. I mean, being able to get 20,000 views on your own in front of and just talk about topics and even more. She gets 47,000 sometimes. She gets 87,000 sometimes. And I don't necessarily think it's all because the Joe Budden podcast. There have been people who've been on the podcast before, and you can tell that the audience migrated right over. Whereas Mona, she was on Breakbeat Media doing them same y'all on her own podcast, which by the way is crushing it for an indie show. She jumped into the ongoing exchange between Jason Lee, Joe Budden, and Melyssa Ford, and she said something that really stood out. She highlighted when Melyssa Ford was on the Joe Budden podcast, and Budden started asking about Jason Lee's Stockton situation, talking about allegedly mismanaged funds. Then they looked to Melyssa for a response, and she straight up refused to answer. Here's the clip. As you can see, Melyssa Ford was clearly hesitant, almost scared to speak about Jason Lee. The theory, Jason Lee knows all her secrets. He hosted her podcast, was her confidant, and knows where the bodies are buried. Honestly, that theory holds weight because she looked like the trunk was about to pop open on live TV. Mona would even say, "Yo, she was scared." Later, Mona adds, "I wouldn't hold my tongue for nobody." That line hits differently because, in contrast, she had previously said she wanted Melyssa Ford on the podcast, even posting a picture making it look like they were cool. Now, in this episode, Mona calls her out, depicting her as almost intimidating. It's interesting because it also exposes the difference between them. Mona speaks freely, while Melyssa Ford stays measured. Some people have called out Mona in the past, like academics or Tony the Closer, and she barely responded publicly. She addressed it on Instagram Live, not on the podcast itself. This moment makes that contrast crystal clear. Mona would speak up. Melyssa wouldn't touch it. You can see Melyssa Ford's refusal to comment on Jason Lee says a lot about her podcasting style. I also think it's shade because speaking on her podcast without filters could have looked a certain way, and Mona didn't seem to care. And here's the kicker. Melyssa Ford's restraint is part of why her podcast works. I know that sounds wild, but it's true. It contrasts with Mona, who feels the need to fill the silence with constant chatter. Mona reminds me of people I've met who just can't stay quiet. She imagines scenarios, riffs off them, but it sometimes overshadows the conversation. Melyssa Ford, by contrast, uses silence as a tool, letting points land without over-explaining. She lets listeners fill in the gaps, and it clearly works. Her podcast was even nominated for an NAACP award. Yes, the very podcast that I and many others joked about is now in line for a major accolade. That's huge because it shows she's built something independent of Joe Budden. If she wins, people will say, "Look what she did without him. She broke away and got recognized." That's the power of starting in a niche, less crowded, easier to stand out, especially if you have personality. Even if you look at other niches like therapy or sexual health, the strategy is similar. Stand out where the audience isn't oversaturated. All right, y'all, that's my take for now. Quick video, let me know what you think about Mona commenting on Melyssa Ford. I know we've been shading Mona, but I'm doing a deep dive Sunday on her last few episodes, breaking down every detail. That said, she's killing it on her own show, hitting 20,000 views on solo episodes, sometimes 47,000, sometimes 87,000. And it's not all Joe Budden's audience migrating. Mona built value independently. She doesn't rely on guests or co-hosts for numbers. Most podcasters lean on celebrity to drive views, but Mona doesn't need that. People genuinely tune in for her personality. Even when she's off on Joe Budden, people compartmentalize. On her own show, she shines. She's one of the best to do it, so I'm tapping in. And I mean, it's not my cup of tea. She kind of reminds me of, Dee and Mr. I Know. You're going to be like, "Oh, Danny, you're reaching." But just like a stream of consciousness type potting, where there's no real structure. She's just riffing off the top. I think that's a severe clash with the Joe Bunning podcast, because they do have somewhat of a structure where they go from topic to topic, and Mona clashes with it often.